Hello and welcome to BMA Violet Hour. My name is Tracy Beal. I'm the manager of public programs at the Baltimore Museum of Art. We are so happy to have you joining us today for yet another edition of BMA Violet Hour. Today we are celebrating the exhibition Frieda Toranzo Jaeger, Perpetual Sense of Redness. The show is going to be on view at the Baltimore Museum of Art until October 3rd. So you can log on to Art BMA and reserve your time tickets to see the show in person. But in the meantime, we are going to have the artist Frieda Toranzo Jaeger here today in conversation with Joshua Chambers-Letson. Joshua Chambers-Letson is actually a professor at Northwestern University. He's a professor of Asian studies as well as performance studies. So before I bring on our guests, I'm going to introduce the curator of the exhibition, Leela Grothy. She is our associate curator of contemporary art at the BMA. How you doing, Leela?
Hey, Tracy.
It's good to see you. Again, this is the second time you've joined us.
That's right. That's right.
So I'll let you take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and good evening, everyone. So I'm introducing Frieda Toranzo Jaeger's exhibition, The Perpetual Sense of Redness. As Tracy mentioned, it's on view at the BMA until October 3rd. The exhibition consists of a single work by the same title, and I'm going to walk you around the piece while I outline some of the core concepts at stake in the work. Here we go. Get that running. Okay, so it's helpful to note that in her practice, Toranzo Jaeger wrestles with the traditions and boundaries that typically confine the many facets of self and heritage. She thinks these issues through using electric cars, which become spaces for the care and celebration of hybrid identities incorporating race, indigeneity, gender, and sexuality. Next slide. The perpetual sense of redness is a multi-panel structure that creates a composite vehicle. It's part car, part spaceship, hinged and folded canvases. As the viewer circles the artwork, next slide, they experience it progress endlessly from sunrise to nightfall, never arriving, never leaving. Each panel is linked by both the organic and the inorganic, where the panels are interconnected by representations of both blood vessels and the pipes of an engine. Next slide. This attention to the inner workings and passageways, combined with an abundant use of the color red, are used as metaphors for the connective tissue of human experience. Next slide. The work calls to mind the redness of pain, love, and the inner machinery of being. Next slide. I'd now like to discuss the electric car itself. For Toranzo Jaeger, the electric car is a potent symbol for psychological space. Next slide. These vehicles look fairly nondescript on the outside, but inside they brim with futurity. They are unburdened by the past. They belong to no particular culture. The artist seizes this inner place as a site for the body. Next slide. Oops, I've gotten off pace a little bit, sorry. And specifically the queer female body. Next slide. These are spaces to feel safe, to feel adventure, to feel compatibility, to feel sensuality. And in addition to oil paint, next slide. Toranzo Jaeger employs an embroidery style particular to the indigenous community from which she descends. The result is a strange, seductive consideration of distinct surfaces of desire, from warm flesh to cool leather seats. This work testifies to the paradox of the colonized indigenous experience, where an indigenous person is suspended in a perpetual state of both preservation and resistance. Toranzo Jaeger boldly imagines a utopian future while simultaneously fighting to protect the past. Next slide. We've invited Joshua Chambers-Letson to our conversation tonight because he is not only a brilliant writer, professor, and theorist, but he was also one of the editors of Jose Esteban Munoz's posthumously published text, The Sense of Brown. This text served as a key theoretical anchor for Toranzo Jaeger while making her piece. She was inspired by its argument for a sense of brownness, in opposition to a fixed Latinx identity confined within the boundaries of the racial and national contours of Latinidad. As this text considers a collective, quote, brown commons, to use Munoz's term, Toranzo Jaeger expands the theoretical structure to include the intersection of an indigenous collectivity within Munoz's constellation of queerness and brownness. So please join me in welcoming Frieda Toranzo Jaeger and Joshua Chambers-Letson.
Hi, everyone. Hi.
Hello. Hi, Frieda.
Good to see you again.
It's good to see you again. This is one of many online dates that we've been having of late in preparation for this, and it's been such a pleasure to be thinking with you about your work. So I'm excited that we're going to be taking it out into the broader commons today.
Yes, me too.
All right. To get started, I'm going to work against all of my capacities, try to pull up a little technological thing and pull up some images. There we go. Working. Okay, good. First thing, yeah. So just to give those of you who have tuned in a little bit of a sense of what's to come, for about the next 30 minutes, Frieda and I are going to engage in a conversation about her practice. In the first half, we'll be looking sort of at where she's been. So we'll be looking at works from the past couple of years and talking about some of the major themes and keywords in the work. And we'll build that then into a conversation of the present exhibition at the museum before turning it over to a Q&A for about 15 minutes during the last bit of time that we have together. So before we start, I thought I would just highlight some of the keywords and thematics in the work that Frieda and I had identified in our conversations. And those of you that are listening will sense immediately that these are big themes, and there's no way we'll be able to cover all of them in all of this time. So some of what we're doing right now is just sort of seeing where we can get with these. But some of the major keywords that we had identified were alter and autonomy and automobile. We didn't just identify those because they are alliterative and so sound poetic, but because they're sort of deeply woven into the work. But also in the mix are themes like queerness, indigeneity, and decolonization. And we're going to start with that first set of three, the alter, autonomy, and the automobile, and move our way out from there. So why don't we just begin? Actually, why don't we begin this way? One of the things that I think for an audience at home is difficult to sort of grasp because of the flatness of the screen is just the extraordinary sensuous materiality of your work. Your work is an interrogation and I think, appropriation of painting. And it involves not just the sort of flatness of painting, but a kind of working together of lots of different types of materials, including fabric. There's a fair amount of textile work in the work, as well as the actual sort of forms that paintings take, such as the altarpiece. So let's just start right there and ask if you'd be willing to talk to us a little bit about your intervention in painting and the sort of forms that it takes in relationship, especially to the question of the altar and the question of autonomy as they materialize in the automobile, which is such a central figure in a lot of your work.
Yes, thank you so much for this lovely introduction. Yeah, you know, I think this piece for me, it's very special. It's my first altar, actually. And as you all know, and you mentioned before, my work has always a decolonial intention. And I think this is very important to point out. And I guess one of the decolonial intentions I really want to take on is the question of autonomy. You know, like as colonized people, we cannot go back to a future that is not only erased and uncertain, but we don't know it very well. And we can also, you know, not just lose all our culture, you know, that will also be crazy, you know, under the oppression of capitalism and Western imperialism. So I'm always like wondering which point could we as colonized people gain some autonomy from all of this? How can we do this? So what I've done here is, it's kind of like a gesture of performativity within painting by, appropriating the altar painting from the 14 and 1500s. What I do, it's kind of like a gesture of saying, I don't want painting to have anything to do with the walls. I want my paintings to come to a place and open them up, and that's it. It's their own stage. They own, the space in a very specific way that it's, autonomous from the wall. So this is like this performative gesture that I integrate into my work to give it an extra political performativity. So, they always have an outside and an inside, because it's a painting that you cannot see as a whole in just one moment. So the painting has to perform itself so you'll be able to see it in its completion. In this case, for example, I love it because I thought, like, how would I pimp my car? How would I do it? I have no money, how would I do it? So I bought the cheapest fabrics I found. And obviously, I love everything that has to do with braiding. I think, it is a beautiful tradition. And I said, I'm going to braid my car. I will braid a friend or something. I wanted to have like this personal relationship to this car. And I love, also the concept of pimping. It's a way to separate yourself, like from a border, like mainstream or like main culture, and then you just do some gesture to separate yourself from it. So yes, this is what I did. I think it is also, I use like fake hair, so it's kind of gross when you go really near it. It's just like hot glue, and it's just like hair and really, really cheap fabrics. But that's the gesture. Like you work with what you have. Around the materials you are able to get, and this was kind of one of the results of that. And I can show other examples if you want.
Yeah, let's pull in other examples. Why don't we just, to give, for those that are looking at home, just to sort of clarify, these two images are the same work, right? And I believe the title is Auto Control as a Form of Landscape. It's from 2017. And so on the left, we see the kind of exterior. And then when that is folded out, what we're seeing is the interior, right? And I think this is also one of the things that your work often plays on, is the relationship between exterior and interior.
Yeah.
So I'll start moving it down so we can see some of the other works. This one here is Hope, the Air Conditioning is On While Facing Global Warming, Part 1, 2017. And again, for those that are watching at home, this piece has multiple elements that are sort of unfolding and opening out.
Yeah, I think this piece is very special one for me. I really like it. On one side you have like this apocalyptical kind of landscape, and I think sometimes when we think about apocalypse, as a concept, is basically what happens with everything around you. Everything you made a connection with, it just kind of disappears. I think fundamentally that's what an apocalypse is. And I think sometimes, especially for minority cultures within the colonies, this is a scenario that happens very often. Like right now, right here, we see it more and more with ecological disasters, obviously in poor and minority communities. So and then you have the other side, which is, this is very clean, kind of commercial, psychological space, because for me, as Leila mentioned before, the car is a psychological space. We are in it, and it's we cannot escape from capitalism, and it's just like ourselves, being trapped in these structures that it's really hard to get rid of. And the painting is painted like in a scale of 1:1, so you cannot see that from the picture, but it's just like I really like to invite the viewer to just like sit down and take the ride of what painting can do. And because fundamentally I want to create artifacts in which we can like talk about the complexities of decoloniality. I mean, I want to talk about diverse subjects and themes, but fundamentally, how are we going to do this? We need like a lot of opinions and people engaging in this conversation. And so this is what I try to do, especially also with the altars, because it is more a bodily experience. They stand as a body and they have the size of your body. So I really like this engagement with the observer of these. Sometimes I also call them like a negative body, because they fulfill all of these parts that our body needs, like to sit on a space. And as you say, with the interiority, for me, it's also very important to show always the car from its interior and not this kind of crazy fetish of male fantasies of the outside of the car as a machine that, I don't know, it's the extension of masculinity and power and control and potency. But, go in, like, it's really important for me to go to this interiority of, body, self, the structures, the mental structures that we are like come across with as colonized subjects.
Something you just said, and I was thinking about this in relationship to the title. I was thinking about two things. One is just something you were just saying on the apocalypse, and you sort of noted the apocalypse has happened, right, or is happening. And it reminds me of one of my favorite, or a thought in a book that has motivated me often, especially in the last 2 years. C. Riley Snorton, who is a theorist who works in Black trans studies, has a really powerful book, Black on Both Sides, Racial History of Trans Identity. And there's a moment in it where he's sort of talking about the possibility of Black trans lives mattering. Right, and he sort of calls upon Fanon, who is one of the sort of most famous decolonial theorists, and he sort of points to the fact that he says something to the effect of maybe in a world where Black trans lives matter, we would be experiencing the end of the world as we know it. And he just sort of pauses and says, "But worlds end all of the time, right?" And I think about that line often in relationship to all sorts of histories of coloniality and racialization. Last year, when the lockdown was coming, I think it was pretty common. I'd teach students and students would say, this is the end of the world. And I would have to say, well, yes, this is the end of a world, right? But there are proliferations of worlds that are ending. And so I think there's something about this relationship between the apocalyptic and then the horizon of possibility in your work. The world as it is, which is a world of sort of patriarchal and masculine domination, which is inhabited in this narrative of the automobile as control. And we can think here of the sort of classic cinematic trope of, say, like Mad Max driving through the landscape in his car, right? And this other sort of realm that you're opening up in the work, which is a realm of interiority and possibility and queer possibility in particular, in which sort of autonomy isn't just about masculine autonomy, but it is about, another sort of way of being in the world. And the automation of the car opens up another way of being in the world. And we catch a glimpse of that in a work like this, which directly invokes what we could see as a kind of bad object of contemporary car culture, which is the Tesla, both a good object in that it is the hope of the sort of post gasoline car, and a bad object in that it is the sort of brainchild of terrible Elon Musk. And you and I were earlier sort of ragging on Elon Musk and Grimes. Just want to get so I wonder if we might sort of think there, then, you have really extraordinary thoughts on what automation might mean and what it might mean in relationship to a decolonial project. And that's something that materializes in works like Tesla.
Yeah, I also think, and we were talking about this before, like the shift of power is going to be such a ontological one when machines, do all the job for us, like, self-driving machines. Like, what will happen with this like heteromasculine dominant space, which is the car, when there's no driving? You don't have to be active. You're completely passive towards this machine. And so there is this space is gonna be real very soon, and it's a space of the future, because obviously I think one of my like central intentions also is to imagine the future, like to reimagine the future by repurposing the past, especially within the painting discourse, and just being like, what are we going to do with all these new spaces that we have never experienced before? And if we are like, you know, intelligent enough, we can just like fantasize about how this future can be completely a queer utopia, you know, like I try to, you know, engage it in my work, and it's just be like, okay, what are we going to do in these spaces, you know, like, I mean, and I always think like, well, I mean, you know, I will like have gay sex in these spaces. Like this is like the first thing comes to my mind. But yeah, you know, just to queericize, just like to break completely, you know, the expectations of what these you know, spaces are gonna be like. And
I want to.
like
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh no, it's
no.
fine.
I'm super sorry. I keep riffing. I'm just trying to pull up because you said queer sex, right? So I was trying to pull up that image precisely so we can see, because this is something that you often give us in the work, is that you don't we don't just infer that queer sex might happen in these spaces. You give us a portrait of this, as we can see in a work like this. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh no, maybe we can put it and I can just elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's great. Let me I was referring specifically to Sappho, which is a little bit up. There we go.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I always been very like serious about you know, painting these explicit scenes. Because I think there is very little lesbian imaginary done by queer or lesbian artists, especially in the past. I mean, it is very few what we can work on. You know, we need these images to learn how to love each other, to learn how to understand each other, how other people have done it in the past, and how can just like reimagine it. So for me, you know, apart maybe like for the shocking value, like I really do it as a way of making, you know, an archive for future generations to look at, that this is really from a perspective of a person that experienced this in her life, her whole life. So I think this is, for me, an important task that I take on myself for the work, to, you know, to be this kind of archive as well, and then become this artifact, and then we can just talk about it. Like, why is this important? Why is this here? Why am I looking at this? You know, like, I think I really want to awake all of these questions in the viewer.
Yeah, this is, and we'll get to this a little bit when we get to the new piece, because one of the things that I think a recurrent motif in your work is that I brought Sappho up here because we can see very clearly how the domain of a kind of queer brown femme sexuality is inhabiting the interior space of the car. But one of a motif that you use often and does appear in the current work is the rear view mirror, right? Where as we're looking into the rear view mirror, that's where we start to catch these sort of scenes of intimacy. We see them sort of in these sort of smaller details. And I think that's a super important dimension. One of the other things I just personally about Sappho that blows my mind, right, is not just that it's an articulation of lesbian and femme sexuality, right, but here we have sort of two brown women who are engaged in sexuality, right, and that there is I mean, one can even infer blackness, one can infer brownness, but it makes me think of this kind of moment in Marlon Riggs's Tongues Untied, where you have recited over and over again the phrase, black men loving black men is the revolutionary act, right? And one could ask the question, okay, but where are femmes in that framework? And I think you're giving a kind of response to that here. And one could sort of argue, right, that this mode of femme sexuality, which is not one that is designed for male scopic pleasure, offers a sort of example of a radical decolonial act, right, where queer sexuality is at the front lines of a decolonial revolution rather than a distraction from it or a problem within it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how, like also Fanon always like pointed out, like one is blackened by the world, and how
Yeah.
Jose also took that quote and says like, we're also browned by the world,
Yeah.
So I think this is really important to, like take agency of our own identity and just like, express what it really is from our own perspective, and, the complexities of it, because it's not, we cannot, reduce ourselves to any of our own exotizations, but we have to go deeper, because it's a very, the complexity within the colonial thinking practice and doing, I think it is really important to address, not being afraid of this complexity, because I guess, sometimes we can get tired a little bit of, the same words being like repeated again and again, like decolonial or identity politics, etc., etc. But the problem is that they are encountering so much complexity. Sometimes I do think we don't have the linguistics to address them, so I think that's why art in general, not only my practice but every practice that is aligned to this discourse, it is very important, because I do think sometimes we lack of linguistics, and that's why we have to repeat ourselves so much, with the same concepts that just like tiring people. But yeah, that's also what this like interiority, like also all the car interiority is also like, to look in and, not like out, this is all like a mental process, also like driving, driving is a passive act that is active, it's like passivity in action. And it's really, painting is the same, you're obviously sitting or standing, and it's a semi-passive action, but it is so active on another level, mental level, visual level. So this is also what I want to, people, to see, that, the passivity in action is also a very important act, like just to sit and let this thing work on you, even if in an abstract way. I think it is very important.
And you saying that just made me think of just before this, I was sitting and sort of working on a piece about Yoko Ono, and I was sort of revisiting some of the literature on Yoko Ono's Cut Piece. And for those who don't know Cut Piece, it's a 1964 performance in which Ono, well, began in 1964. She did a number of iterations of it. But she would enter the stage in her best clothes and sort of sit on the stage with a pair of scissors and invite the audience to come and cut away at her clothing. And one of the things that a number of feminist theorists and Asian American theorists, people like Vivian Wong, Julia Bryan Wilson, Peggy Phelan, have all sort of keyed in on that piece, is that Ono sort of presents what seems to be a stereotypical form of Asian femininity, which seems to be a kind of passivity, which instead sort of shifts the focus to the actions of the people around her, how they interact with her, such that that passivity actually becomes a complex negotiation with forms of control, with forms of agency, with even becoming a kind of mirror to the violence that some of the men in the scenario enact on her. And I've been thinking just sort of about how that sort of radical inversion of passivity that you're discussing right here also plays, I think, in a lot of the ways in which you are inverting pictorial and figurative tradition, as we see in this image of Sappho, but also even in the sort of figurative tradition of painting, in which women and femmes are often presented as kind of objects for scopic pleasure. And here you sort of interchange this with the car, but it has a radically different effect. I'm going to leap us forward to, because we were talking about this sort of activity, to this image is probably as the last image for us to talk about with your sort of previous body of work before we move into the new work. And I cannot even pretend to say the title of this piece because I don't speak a lick of German, a lick of German. So I'll leave that to you. But again, for folks at home, this is again the same piece, right? We're seeing the interior of the piece on the left, and we're seeing the exterior of the piece on the right. And I jumped to this piece specifically because I was thinking about what you were talking about in relationship to passivity. and how you said that painting is a kind of passive act. And a question that popped up for me is, when you say that, do you mean that painting is a passive act for the painter or for the spectator? Because I was thinking, you know, one of the things about your invocation of the altar, and we talked about this earlier, is that the altar is a performative work. You come into relationship with it. You have a religious experience that the spectator creates with the work. So it's really not passive at all, right? Spectating is active in that sense. And I'm just wondering, you know, do you think of that passivity in relationship to the painter and the spectator, or both? And, you know, how does that map out in a work like this, whose title I, again, cannot pronounce with apology?
Ja, don't worry. It's called Der Werte, die Ware drücken sich am besten in dem Körper den anderen aus. So it's a really long title. Like sometimes I like to do that, but so basically, you know, it talks about, you know, when you desire, you know, like it's a very simple example. You see a beautiful dress and you see it on someone else, and then it's when the desire arises to have the dress. So so basically, it's you know, it's also like has to do a lot with communism and so on. But for me, it's just a way to address how capitalism shapes our desires. And this is kind of the like worst danger of capitalism, because basically everything we desire is constructed by these structures that end us oppressing us. And oppressing us by creating our own desires and keeping us in like cycles and loops of like many times almost like slaverish, you know. So so yeah, this is a work like about that. But about your question of passivity, I think it is like, you know, I think it's a passivity in action, which means that maybe it's physically passive for the painter, but it's so active, you know, in the realm of fantasy and imagination, or like, you know, vitalistic fantasies, you know, like Isabel Graf has like this concept that I really like, that, you know, painting like activates a lot of fantasies that are very vital, and they're very like, you know, important for activating thoughts and feelings, etc. So yeah, I think, you know, it's physically passive, but it's so active, you know, it's like going really fast in the car, you know, like the landscape even just like kind of melts into one, and you're going super fast and everything is changing, and, you know, you are having all of your experience, all of these just very fast. And sometimes I think the mind can be so much like it. And as well, like painting, even though it seems not like the fastest activity, like so much is vitalized, you know, through the act of painting, that you have so many thoughts. You're always like questioning what you're doing, you know, you're always like in confrontation. But physically, it's very passive action, you know, like you don't need a specific body action to do so, or I mean, at least the way I paint. I know there's a lot of different painters out there. But yeah, and then, you know, obviously I want to refer to this by making these altar paintings that they have, again, so many movements. So you can see that this was not such a, you know, static action or like one thought, but it's a thought that it can be moved, it can be closed, it can be open. Like, you know, it can be closed in so many ways. So, so yeah, and then the painting is performing itself.
It's amazing. It's so a quick thought as we transition. You were describing here a kind of practice of multiplicity, and I was thinking that one of the things that your work really does is displace the sort of phallic authority of the painter, right? In which power really is identified through the sort of the phallus, which is so singular. And instead, what you're constantly giving us is folds, interiors upon interiors. This image, which we were loving on earlier in our conversation with each other, is very much about the sort of fold in the interior. And one can see the kind of birth of the world, but one can also see, you know, interior worlds such as the pleasures of the golden shower manifesting here. And I think from there, why don't we turn our attention to the work at hand, which will take all of these themes that we've been talking about and manifest them. So this is the first installation shot from the sense of perpetual sense of redness. And I wonder if a place to start as we think through this piece together, why don't we start with the title, actually, which Leila established as a referent to José's work in the sense of Brown, but is doing its own kind of work, its own kind of performative enunciation. So will you sort of walk us through that, and then walk us through how this piece came to be, how you conceptualized and executed it, before we go into some of the more details of the work?
Yeah, well, this is my biggest piece to date, which, I was super excited about because it's a huge, beautiful space in this old museum. So apart from my automobile work, I really wanted to implement also like an imaginary world. Like, what is it really? What are the effects that kind of, bring us together, and how like to deal with them? So for example, in this piece, I brought like the bed, like, first of all, because I think in pandemic times, I don't know, the bed is also like the deepest space. It's where you go to sleep, where you go to dream, like where you make love. Like, this is such a deep, it's the deepest space, at least in my house. I don't have a big house, so so all my most exciting activities, I do it on the bed because so I just love this space because of its depth. Like, I think it's it's a place of a lot of depth, like emotionally. So and then I thought, because we were like locked up inside our homes, like this relationship grow even like deeper, in a way. Like, I mean, I personally like do every office work in my bed, like at this point, because it's just like, who cares, So obviously in pandemic times, this was like so much highlighted. And so yeah, for me, the bed is like a place that maybe in our contemporaneity, everybody can relate to. It's a very easy place. It's like the car, it's an easy place. And you don't need like highly intellectual or knowledge of painting to relate to those places and to the depth of them. So this was like, one of these imaginary spaces. I wanted to open this interior, to invite people just to dream about it. Like, why are you dreaming? Why are you thinking, in this like super intimate and kind of interior space? And like, as Leila said, the use of the color red is also like, for me, a way to kind of, through the color and the semiotics of it, like trying to see like, how is my identity translated to this piece? How am I doing that? Like ontologically speaking, how am I, translating all of these to there? How is this process going? So all of the embroidery, which is, a lot of veins, also have to do with that, how to transmit one's own feelings, thoughts, identity, politics, and intentions into a piece of art. How does that happen? And obviously it's not an answer, it's just obviously just showing the process, like something that is transmitted by blood, like, children, diseases, whatever, like I am just trying to kind of make a metaphor through that, blood as something that is transmitted, and me transmitting something into something else. So so yeah, that's how these round spaces, which also I use from these like post-colonial images, that a lot of them were round. They're round compositions that begin in the center and go simultaneously to all sides. So I just thought like that point, like that fugue point, of immersion and then explosion. I thought it would be really important for me to compose a painting of the imaginary in that form.
It's amazing. I'm sorry.
Maybe we can show another slide.
Yeah, I was about to jump forward. I was thinking this thing that you said about the bed. I realized that the bed really did become the car this last year. The bed with the laptop. That was how we traveled to places. I mean, our entire relationship has unfolded now across two continents, and it's entirely been done vis-a-vis our computers. And some, like today earlier, I was literally sitting on the bed while we were talking with each other. And the car is again a returned motif here. And one of the things I just highlight in this image is again, the profound materiality of the work, that you expose the backside of the canvas, that we can actually see where you're weaving the blood that you were just discussing into the canvas, and we can see the sort of detritus of that on the other side of the canvas. I'm going to move us forward. Oh, and also to highlight, for those who can't see the detail, that in the driver's side mirror, again, we have a scene of sensuous sexuality, right, between two femmes happening. I'll move forward into this image. So this is where you were talking just about the circle, and this might be another place to sort of riff on that and allow us to think specifically about the questions of redness and indigeneity as they're materializing in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like when we were rationalized by these German anthropologists that, I don't know why, that stay forever and ever within the like Western culture. But, indigenous were like labeled as red. So for me, it is very important to point out that, indigeneity is in a perpetual state of suspension. I think, we live in a suspension state where the future is very uncertain because we are really trying to, protect our cultures, but that is not going forward. This is protect what we already have. And at the same time, which future can you imagine when everything where you live, what you drink, what you eat is in jeopardy? So, we are kind of like in this bubble of time where future is very hard to imagine for us. And at the same time, we don't want to like lose, the roots of what we are. So I think, for me, it was like very important, to point that out. Like, as Leila mentioned, I have indigenous heritage and have a lot to do with the community. So it is something that I see. And I think it's not only visible in them, but I think to every Latin person, we are also in the verge of losing a lot of our culture because of capitalism, because of progress, because it becomes unsustainable. So yeah, everyone, even, if you live in a small town, then you have to leave because there's no work. And then all of your rituals around this small town, you're going to lose them in the city. You're just going to go and, live somewhere else when this doesn't exist. So I think this is like a state that every colonized people in one way or the other relates to, the idea of wanting to preserve, but also wanting a future, like a new future, like away from many things. And you are like sort of in this in between. And and this composition obviously shows kind of like the cemetery, which is death, which is also like a very important part of Mexican culture in general, and some landscapes of the desert where I come from. So I just think it is just, very fundamental facts of what kind of affectivities bring us all together as, for example, Mexicans. It's really hard to rationalize Mexicans because we are such different, we come from all races, like colonization, like fucked us all basically. So, it depends who fuck you who first, but yeah, so, it's just like and I think like Jose also in his book points this out, which is very important for me, like how Latinidad, it's not about race, but about affectivities, and how do we experience these affectivities in the collectivity. So for me, these imaginary spaces are about that, are about what kind of affects bring us together in this being in the world, in this particular space in the geography that makes us kind of identify us as one or part of something bigger.
We're about to shift into the sort of open Q&A, and I know that there are some questions that are already lining up in the box. So for those who have asked, don't worry, we'll get to them. But maybe I think as a sort of last question, and to build off of that is something that you and I have been talking a lot about, and you were just gesturing to this, that thinking about the way in which Latinidad can be produced through affect and through relation. And we've been talking a lot, something that you've said to me a number of times that has been really striking is within your own community, indigeneity being conceptualized not really as a kind of fixed racial identity, but having much more to do with sort of kinship and practice and one's relationship to the community, specific relationship to the community.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the reasons I'll say use the language of sense, is that sense is a kind of way of feeling, it's a kind of way of touching, but it's also sort of imprecise, right? It can't be fixed in the way that, say, visual racial ontologies try to fix someone. And both you and I exist in bodies that don't always match the racial ontologies that are expected of us.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you might speak a little bit about how that sense, how that feeling of redness in this particular text, but also that sense of Latinidad is materializing in this particular work, and where you think it's taking us if we were to get into this car with you.
Well, I think I try to make this hybrid, because at the very end, I think to preserve and to move forward, we will have to hybridize ourselves. It has to be a hybrid. So we cannot, keep not changing. We have to change, is normal. So we will have to imagine a hybrid intention and culture of what we want, what we want to keep, what we don't want to keep, what are we going to be. So this is a little bit what I try to do with painting, a little bit by, making it like a weird sculpture. And it's also, you can see it from the inside, and it's just like, breaks all the illusionism of painting, because I'm not a trained painter. I'm not so interested in like creating illusions through paint. On the contrary, I just want to be like, this is an object of dialectic use. It's, please use it to think and not to be kind of, distracted by, oh, look, this is really real, or it looks like a photograph, So, yeah, and it's very like simply done. It's not very high tech or whatever. You can see the process, you can see what it's made of, how it's made. So, and it's like a weird like sculpture painting, and it just stands in an uncomfortable place. And this is where, I want kind of like people to think, first of all, Latinidad finds itself right now, but at the same time, we have all this hope and possibilities of future, because, we are not, because, we are going to change in a very drastic way, and we are waking up to decolonized thinking everywhere, and we are realizing what they did to us, repurposing history, finding strength and utopias in history. Oh my God, my Siri.
No.
Siri, no.
That was beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, basically this is what I want like to propose, like this uncomfortable, weird moment, but full of hope and imagination.
That is beautiful. And it's a good place for us to pivot to some of the questions that are coming to us from our viewers. So we have a couple of questions lined up, and I think the first one, I'll pull up this image because it allows us to kind of see the texture and the materiality of the work, but also the intensity of the embroidery, which I just love. And you spoke a little bit about the braiding in the first image that we showed. And I always think about, braiding as such a social act that, like, we were talking earlier about braiding, and I was going to try to get my partner to braid my hair today, but he's at work. He's a hairstylist. But one of the things about anytime I ask him to do that is I recognize both that I'm asking for a labor from him, but also that there's so much care in taking the time to sort of embroider, whether it's braiding in the hair or embroidery here in the work. So one of the questions, and I apologize to our interlocutors for mispronouncing names, but I believe it's Terry Henderson has asked, in terms of your materials, can you tell us about the significance of the embroidery of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think embroidery is very important. I think embroidery contains the history of women, of feminism. It's a struggle. It is a very anti-capitalistic type of work, because it's so marginalizing. You need so many hours. Everything is hand embroidered. Everything is done by relatives of my family, which I pay them very well, and we talk a lot about it, but basically they're so much better than I am. So at the beginning of my work I used to do it myself, but obviously it became unsustainable, so now I only work with my family. But I believe it's also a very important move for me to implement this history, because embroidery has always been seen as a low art, like handcraft, not really high art like painting. Painting is the highest commodity, so the highest kind of luxury. So for me to penetrate that culture with an handcraft that contains the history of women, I think puts painting in like an unusual place. So I like to put painting in this place. So from which history are we going to talk about this work? From which place? So that's why it is very important for my paintings to have some type of embroidery. And this obviously was like a form of embroidery that we thought how to make it so big. So we use like bigger, I don't know how to say in English, threads. Yeah, so we use bigger threads, and we use the pompons. I mean, these are pompons for Christmas. I mean, this is, this is also something that we just came up with because I really wanted that more texture. So we integrated the feathers and the smaller pompons, so people could see it from more afar, that it has like a special texture. And then, the veins are so thin and they're so precious that makes it hard to see. You have to be very close to experience that.
It's beautiful. Sort of continuing on the question of material. Ikea King asked, in terms of your materials, can you tell us, I'm sorry. Going back to process, your canvases are relatively large. So how long do these pieces typically take you? Do you create them all at different times, or did the timing overlap due to similar themes? And what is the thought process behind deciding which pieces use just paint and which ones use fabric or other materials?
Well, this is my first large work with embroidery. Like usually I do either altar paintings, and I think in most of the altars you can see that there is textile work, but not embroidery as really conservative. So yeah, this is the first piece that I kind of have both of them. It takes a long time. It takes a very long time. It takes like really, I don't know, I think this took like a year. So I first embroidered the canvas because if I embroider it after, the paint around it gets very damaged, and then it just loosens the paint, so it doesn't look really good. So I have to embroider it first, and then I have to paint. So I have to structure everything a little bit like clearly, like this is the drawing, this is the embroidery, and then I paint the whole thing at the end. But obviously this was a very ambitious project, and thanks to COVID, it could happen for all of us. But yeah, usually I embroider smaller works and not these big ones. So this was really a big undertaking, but we did it, and I'm super happy for the result. But yeah, it was not easy. It took like a year.
It's funny because in knowing that your family does the embroidery work and knowing that you have to incorporate the embroidery before the painting, there's also then this conversation with your family that's happening as you develop the work, because on some level they also determine and set the direction in which their work is going to determine and set the direction in which the work is going to unfold as you produce it.
Absolutely.
Let me jump to the next question that we have. This is from Alex Song. And the question is going back to something we were talking about earlier, which is sort of passivity. Painting is a passive act, and active passivity. So the question is, could you please elaborate on the concept of active passivity? How do you feel that this idea can be applied by society today in the name of progress?
Wow, that's hard. But I mean, I can.
That's hard.
It was quite hard. Oh my God, so much responsibility. But no, I mean, I want to say that I just think we should take the freedom ourselves to let our imagination just go, go as deep and as crazy. I think we don't exercise this enough. Even I, as a painter, sometimes I have so many mental restrictions about my work itself, insecurities, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think, the passive, the passivity in action is also a form to say that we should nourish our inner world a lot, our inner fantasy world. It should be something that we are not afraid to do, because in order to create the future for progress or for any other purpose, we have to imagine. So that's where the future starts. So I think this is what I mean. Starting to imagine the future is an action that happens passively in activity, because you are not creating it physically. You have to imagine it first and then create it and then experience it. But so that's a little bit what I mean with passivity in action. We should just let ourselves imagine as much as we need.
That makes me think of there's a scholar whose work I really love, Kelly Chung, and she has been working on a project in which she thinks about artistic practices that are engaged in the history of sort of representing and intervening in labor, and in particular the exploitation of the labor of folks of color. And one of the things she sort of notes is that in the pictorial and art historical tradition, right, political intervention is often framed in these kind of masculinist terms of, the revolutionary storming the gates. And we see this, for example, in the sort of, even in the murals of Diego Rivera, right, where we see this kind of the production and the building of a different world. And Chung is really interested in artists who engage passivity as a kind of alternative way of being. And she does frame this as a kind of feminist intervention, right? Passivity, which gets framed as the domain of the feminine, and activity then as the realm of the revolutionary masculine. And she says, well, where do we find forms of passivity that allow us to sort of rethink and remake the world? And that might bring us to one of the images of sort of sexuality that appears in the work, which just makes me think of the ways in which, sex itself often engages in forms of what you're describing here as a kind of active passivity, in which entire new worlds can sort of emerge and come to us. I think we have time for one last question. So this is from Jose Benjamin Ciesa Hurtado. Following Nikea's question, usually, how long does it take you to prepare the images for a show and then the actual making of the pieces?
Well, I have to say, I also work a lot with architecture. I think, it might be not super clear, but this piece is in a rotunda. So I really wanted to, play with that, fact that it's round, so I didn't want to make it completely round, but also not completely squared. So once, I get a sense of the architecture, and once again, I get a sense of the place that the painting is going to live in, then it doesn't take me much. I'm a very fast decision-making person. So, so I take the decisions pretty fast, and then the making depends on the embroidery a lot of the times, because obviously the embroidery takes a lot of time. But yeah, I would say for such a big project like this, I would need 8 months for a year just to really finish everything up. Obviously, I sometimes have to do a lot of things on the side, which also slows the process. But yeah, this is a very huge thing. But normally for smaller or medium work, it would take me a month or something. I'm not an artist that produces a lot, so that's why it takes me some time.
I would disagree only in the sentiment that you're not an artist that produces a lot, because I actually think that you're an artist that produces an exceptional amount. You produce entire worlds within not just one canvas, but the sort of interlacing of canvases together, and they're worlds that allow us to sort of imagine a critique of the insufficiency of the present world, as Munoz was often asking us to do, but also really allows us to travel to the possibilities of other worlds in which decoloniality is an actual possibility, right? Not merely a sort of theoretical proposition. So with that, we are at the end of our hour.
Amazing.
It flew by.
It felt so easy. I was so nervous. It's my first time, everyone. So I was really nervous. But yeah, Joshua, you make it super easy. It was such a delight.
It has been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And you had no reason to be nervous. I knew just from the last few days of talking with you that you would be as fabulous and brilliant and engaging as you have been. So thank you so much for the generosity of your work and of your space and your time today.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure for me, and I'm sure for those who are watching at home. And thank you for all who joined us.
Yes, thank you so much. And I wish I could meet all of you in the future and, have live conversations.
There's time for that yet.
Yeah.
Great. Can you hear me now? Now you can. Okay, good. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Joshua. Thank you, Frieda, for joining us. This was a really, really interesting and just candid conversation. I really appreciate the two of you being here. And for folks that are watching, I always feel like it's important for people to know that you co-create these talks. You co-created this talk with us, So a lot of this, we have to just sort of say kudos to you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure working with you guys. So for the folks that are tuning in, thank you so much for watching this evening. Thank you to obviously Frieda and Joshua. I want to thank Andrea, who is our person behind the scenes, and also just send a special thank you to Nakia King. She was our intern for the summer in the education department. So I was excited to see her tuning in with us. So you can actually join us for the next BMA Violet Hour. It's going to be live and in person at the Baltimore Museum of Art. We have a performance with Brandon Woody and Asia Shaw. That's on September 22nd. So stay tuned to our social media as well as our website for updates on that and other programs and events that are coming up. So thank you everyone for joining and tuning in. And also Leela Grothy, thank you so much. I'll see you all next time.